now.
All right. Welcome back, everyone, to In Pursuit of Our Roots. Hey, we'd love for you to join us on this journey of knowledge. We post the pages that we read on our Instagram story. The book we read is Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans by Deborah Gray White, Mia Bay, and Waldo E. Martin Jr. We are on Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram at In Pursuing Our Roots. Please follow. Thank you.
All right, guys. So today we're going to be doing Chapter 3, Part 1, African Americans in the Age of the Revolution. So let's just head into it. So this takes place after the Santo Rebellion, with a lot of slaves uprising and most of them being hanged or sadly cut into pieces to show other Africans living not to uprise against the white man. So during the winter of 1741 in the British colonies, they were quick to blame a lot of fires that were happening in Lower Manhattan on a massive slave conspiracy. And they note that the first fire took place in Fort George, and it contained Lieutenant Governor George Clark's mansion. And onlookers were disturbed to note that although some Blacks pitched in to help, not all of them were there to try to fight the fire. They also said, the onlookers, they saw some Blacks, whispering, darn it, how come, this man and his family just couldn't, burn in the fire. Others saw, other Africans dancing and stuff. So I kind of wanted to start off and ask you guys, I'm gonna start off with Jackson and just say when you read that part, how did you kind of feel? And when I read that part and they were looking about, I'm just why are you an onlooker and you're not helping with the fire yourself? You're not doing anything to be able to notice what's going on around you. And I'm
are you talking about the white onlookers or the Black onlookers?
The white onlookers, because it said the white onlookers were saying that some Blacks weren't helping out, some were dancing, and others were just oh my goodness, this place just needs to burn down. But you kind of, in that sense, at that time, if you were an enslaved African, you would just think well, you guys haven't just straight up luxury, and I'm over here all the way in the dumps and I'm being oppressed. So very different outlooks on what's going on with these fires.
That's a really good thought. I didn't even think of that. I put it in terms of myself. If I saw what's that billionaire's name, Jeff Bezos. If I saw his mansion burning down, will I rush to help him out? No, probably not. Because he has so much money, he has so much luxury, this isn't going to hurt him at all. That millionaire, the person whose house was burnt down, he's going to build a new one. It's not going to be a bad hit to him at all. As long as his family's out, he can get more stuff. It's not the worst thing ever. So I can see why they didn't help. I can see why someone was dancing around, finally, these people who keep bullying us and bullying us and bullying us. Finally, something bad happens to them for once,
What do you think about it, Carrington?
I didn't, when you first asked the question, I didn't think of it in the perspective that Jackson just said, but I do agree with what he's saying, that after oppressing so many people, then something bad happens to them. Of course you wouldn't want to help, especially when you know that they have the power and the ability to just build a brand new lifestyle for themselves that others that they oppressed wouldn't have.
Good. Christian?
I agree. But besides the fact that they knew and we know that they could easily just rebuild and go on with the life. I mean, we looking at karma, that's karma. That's what you get, Let's let it keep happening, I want this to happen every day. And that's, that's my outlook on it. It's okay, shit. When is it gonna keep happening? When are we gonna stop being oppressed, and when can we oppress them? And and that's how I feel. I'm gonna be honest. Yeah.
Agreed. So it says by the end of this all, because they brought in blacks and whites, and by whites I mean like indentured servants of lower class people. So they brought them in and interrogated them. So at the end of like their interrogation and trials, 17 blacks and 4 whites had been hanged, 13 blacks had been burned at the stake, and 70 blacks and 7 whites were banished from the colonies. So you can already like kind of tell the difference when it comes to blacks and whites, when it comes to punishment, a lot more blacks than it is a lot more whites. And this also in the colonies illuminated the dangers of slavery as well as the interracial freedom struggles in colonial America. So I wanted to ask you guys that these people, the colonists, the white colonists, that they just automatically assume that the black man did this, like the black person started the fire, when you read later down in the book that it was black and whites of lower class, but they come to a conclusion that the black man is more dangerous than the white man could be. So I wanted to start off with Carrington and ask, how do you like feel about that? Like, it was both blacks and whites. Some of them did start the fire, some of them didn't. But at the end, blacks are being the most upfront in the colonies about like colonists are thinking they're the most dangerous at the moment. Like just scratch like the white counterparts. Like it's black people who are dangerous when both black and white were starting fires.
I think that it feeds into the whole like idea and stigma that those that black people are more violent and dangerous than other people, when history shows that actually the colonizers and white counterparts were actually more dangerous and initiated violence, and others would react in their own way. So I think that I wasn't surprised that like automatically they'd blame black people for the fire instead of blaming all the people who did it.
Christian?
I agree. I really feel like the mindset, comes into play as well. White people feeling and thinking that they're superior and looking at us as if we were inferior. So of course, when something bad happens, all the blame is gonna go on us. All the blame is gonna go on us, regardless of the fact if it was all of it, if we did it to the fullest, or if we did it halfway, or if we even barely did it. It makes sense as to why they would blame, us as to why, the fire got started and etc. And why the punishment was even worse for us. So, okay, we know all of y'all didn't do it, but we don't ever want this to happen again. So let me set the record straight. And that's how I feel about it.
Jackson?
I agree with both you and Christian. And I think Christian had a really good point with saying that, they wanted to prove a point here. They let the white people, they let them leave the state, but the black people, they got burnt at the stake, and that shows how far they're willing to go to prove this point, to make sure that this never happens again, to make sure us black people, they want to put us in our place, make sure we don't rise, make sure we don't realize our self-worth, make sure we feel like we can't do anything ever.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. So it goes on to talk about, it touches a little bit about the revolution. It doesn't like go way into depth about it because that's later on in the chapter, but it notes the obvious that discontented blacks with no property or privileges to preserve saw the revolution as an opportunity to win their own freedom, because the British, if they were offering, if you were black, your freedom if you fought on their side, and on on the colonist side, they were offering freedom to Blacks if they enlisted with them. The British did it first. They were offering Blacks their freedoms. The colonists were very reluctant to enlist Black soldiers, fearing a slave revolution. But after 1775, all the colonists followed suit. So I wanted to ask, so the revolution, like as we all know in like our textbooks, against like 13 colonies and the British Empire at the moment, literally 13 colonies fighting for just freedom and wanting to do what they want from like British control, and knowing that there were Blacks fighting on both sides. Do you think that the Blacks fighting on both sides, that they really cared about the outcome of like the war, or was it just solely focused on like moral gain? Like I would, if I was fighting, I would only care about like the moral gain that I want. I really wouldn't care about any patriotism or anything like that. My only mindset would be like, all right, like if I go up in here, like I can walk away like a free man and I don't have to deal with this no more and stuff like that. But also, if they did fight and if a side, like hypothetically, like even though we've passed this moment, like if Britain won and like the colonists lost, do you think there would have been like a change in like, all right, like more people start to fight with the British and being free? Like I just want to get like you guys' like concept on it all. Like overall, do you think the morals of enslaved Africans that were fighting on both sides, do you really think it was really to help both sides try to like win this war, or was it just more of like, hey, my own moral gain, I see my own like route and like how I can get to be free? So I'm going to start off with Christian on this one.
I would say, that's tough, but I'm gonna say the moral gain. When freedom comes into play, I feel like that's the only thing you're gonna be on. You're gonna be hell bent on. I want to be free. I want to experience what they've had their whole entire lifetime, and just for a little bit of mine. So I feel like it was for the moral gain.
Great. Jackson?
This is a really good question, by the way, Sierra. Shout out. But honestly, I don't think they cared, to be honest, I think it was more for slavery, because at the end of the day, it'd still be a white man running over them no matter what government it was. But I was thinking about when I read this, would it have been better for Black people if the British had won the war? British got rid of their slavery sooner, even their politics with Black people. It's not the best, I'm going to say, but it is better than America, at least. So when I was thinking about it, I'm like, it would be better if the British would have won for Black people in the end, which is actually really sad to say, and how things ended up. And I also wanted to pose an extra question, if I could, to everyone about, would you fled to Britain, to get your freedom? Would you do that? Or would you stay in America and fight if given the choice? Because I was thinking, looking at, with hindsight, it's kind of easier, it'd be like, okay, I can go to Britain, they had everything better. But without hindsight, do y'all think y'all would have the foresight to go to Britain, take another risk, go on another boat to another land you don't know, to go fight a war that you don't believe in?
So we're going to answer that question, but I want Carrington to answer the question I posed, and then we'll go for full circle to answer yours. So Carrington, how do you feel about the first question asked?
Can you I'm having a hard time understanding the question. Can you just phrase it again about if I would choose, if I think that I'm fighting?
To rephrase the question, so Blacks fought on both sides of the revolution, the British and the colonist side. So my question is, do you think it was just for them fighting on both sides, just a moral gain? That way they could be free and not really caring about what the war was really about for like both sides, but just like their moral like gain and just wanting to be like free, since that was what both sides were offering.
Yeah, I definitely think that it was for a moral gain so that they could, I don't think they really were fighting for the war, but more so their freedom.
Okay. To answer Jackson's question, I think if I was them and I was wanting to go to Britain instead of staying in like the colonies and like go on Britain's side, I think there would be a lot of factors to consider in doing that, mainly just because I could walk down the street and someone could be like looking at me if I was trying to make like a break for it, and them thinking like, where is this black chick going when she really doesn't have that many rights? If I did make it to Britain, if I did go over to Britain, of course they like ended slavery sooner, but also like I would have to go through the kind of through the motions of just kind of being questioning like, do I really have rights, and like da 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 this and that, kind of like I really wouldn't know what the aftermath would be when they like abandoned slavery, and like what I would have to like go through after that. And it's like the mindset, like, is the aftermath going to be actually worse than like slavery it's like self, for which like they still don't treat me as if like I'm an equal human being. The only thing they're stating is that like, hey, you're a free person, but like you mean nothing. You just get to like sit on the sides while we make all the decisions. And like, hey, you might not even have a job. Like you might not even get to open, like if you want to open like a shoe store or whatever during that time. So would I make a break for it? Probably, but also I'd have to think consciously of like what's going to happen to myself if I do get over there than staying in America. But knowing Americans' history after like the revolution, I think I would just like go to Britain. But that's just my statement on that question.
Yeah, I agree with what Sierra is saying. I think that knowing what I know now, I definitely probably would have fled to Britain, but I think that it would, either way, it really would have been a risk, and I would have had to think about how I would have been treated, like she was saying, after slavery ended, because even though slavery ended, they may not feel that we deserved the same rights that everyone else had. Even though we weren't enslaved people, we still probably wouldn't have, there would be no way of telling if they would think we deserve to be able to build a life for ourselves. So but I would have fled to Britain in the end, because I think it would have been the lesser of two evils.
Very true. Very true. Very true.
Christian, do you have anything to say on that question?
Can you like y'all rephrase that question again?
So,
The one you asked after the one Jackson asked?
yeah.
Okay. I would say for the sheer fact that my family and even maybe and possibly some friends are back, if I had family, if they weren't stripped and taken away from me, and of course friends would be made. I don't know. I don't know if I would, if I would just go there solo dolo for a whole new opportunity to fight a war that I don't know about, that I don't care about, put my life at risk for a country that doesn't care about me. It's like, and then also put my life at risk by getting on the boat, facing possibly getting a disease or getting really sick or seasick. There's so many things that come into play. Ah, I don't think I would. But then again, I do think I would. I just don't know.
Christian, that's a good point about that boat. I don't know if I get back on another boat after the first
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
I didn't even think
It's that boat for me. It's the
That
boat.
boat.
That
Yeah.
boat. We talked about that boat now. We've talked about
Yeah,
the boat, what was going on there.
it's that boat.
It's
That's
that boat for all of us.
real.
That boat can be life-changing in decisions.
Oh yeah.
All right, so as the revolution offered like different routes for freedom, like religious revivals were like creeping in, like the Great Awakening that we've all read about in our history books and our history teachers be talking about, like the Great Awakening, everybody. All right, so it also fostered of Utilitarianism, which if you don't know that word, it is a school of thought within political philosophy that builds from the concept of social equality, prioritizing it for all people. So, during like the revolution and as the British, as the Americans and like the colonies, they were struggling to free themselves from like British domination, like, some of them were like thinking like, is like, they were questioning themselves about like the legitimacy of slavery. It's like, thank you. You're having like a whole revelation of like, like slavery seems kind of bad to like do this. Like good for you, good for you. So whites, they like freed more than 20,000 slaves during the final decade of the 1780s, and their action helped to erode slavery in America, resulting in a new nation where slavery was permitted in some states but not in others. So I kind of wanted to ask you guys on this question, on the last statement that is said about how it set up the nation where slavery was permitted in some states but not in others. Do you think that when that happened, that was somewhat like the forming of like the North and like the South, like they were setting themselves up for like that situation? Because it seems like a tipping scale, kind of, really, when they didn't really erode of all slavery. Like some slaves got to keep it, some just didn't. So Jackson, I wanted to start off with you with that question. Do you think that they set themselves up for which, like, now you have like the North and like you have the South and like their characteristics?
I think you are 100% right about that. I think this is what started the tensions between the North and the South. It really started like the different viewpoints of the North and the South that we still see even today,
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it was like 3 weeks ago, they had NASCAR with all the Confederate flags and stuff waving around, and they're at the rally and stuff. So you still see those viewpoints even today. Those lines are ever present.
Agree. Carrington?
Yeah, I definitely think that was like the foundation and the base of two separate sides and different ideas forming about if enslaved people, maybe not just even like enslaved people, but just like rights in general, like who deserved what. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that definitely started the foundation of.
Oh yeah.
Christian?
Yeah. I agree. I agree with what they both said. There's not much I can say. I think I can even touch on that. I agree with you.
I think you might have to talk more into your mic or your phone just a little bit. I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, my phone was covered. I said I agree. I agree with what they said.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Carrington said like what I was thinking, and Jackson said a little bit of what I want to touch up on. So y'all got it.
So going on, so African American life in the 18th century North America. So slaves and free blacks across the colonies. So that little like revelation that they were having about like, is like the legitimacy of slavery, that just went out the door because mid-18th century white laborers were in short supply throughout the colonies after the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. So that reduced the flow of European indentured servants. So that shortage led to the colonists embracing more of slavery. So how do you guys feel about that? I was just like, that didn't even last that long, really. They just embraced just inviting slavery into their lives because like they just really needed it, even though they just questioned themselves a couple of years back, like, should we even like have slavery? Like, what is the point? Like, is it legitimate? So Carrington, I want to see what you thought about it. Like, how did you feel when you like read that mid-18th century they like brought like more slaves in because screw the revelation that they had a couple years back. They're just like, nah, we need these people. It's legitimate.
Right. It was kind of just like they had the revelation and then they were like, life is too hard without it, and they wanted to be selfish, so they just decided to find a way to justify their actions, like maybe this is actually what we're supposed to do because life isn't supposed to be this hard, so maybe we do need to have enslaved people to do all our work for us because we're too lazy to do it. Like, it was just like, wow, I don't know. I just felt like they took one step forward and then several steps back and kind of just set back enslaved people having rights and no longer being enslaved.
Exactly. It's like a slap in the face to an enslaved Black person. Like, okay, what's going on? Christian?
Yes. Again?
You mind repeating what you just said?
Huh?
Did you want me to repeat the question again?
Yeah.
So I was asking, how do you feel? Because we just talked about how the colonists, they were questioning the legitimacy of slavery. And some of them, like, they released a lot of slaves, like 20,000. But then we come to the mid-18th century and they're low on supply when it comes to indentured servants. And so they're just like, all right, we're going to bring in more slaves. So how do you feel about that? They took a couple steps forward, but they just took 1,000 steps back.
Feel like if they would have had a plan, a better plan, as to how they want to gradually and slowly release slaves instead of being, it seems impulsive. Like, okay, you know what? This is messed up, so we're gonna let these slaves go, and then boom, after a certain amount of time, like, oh crap, we need stuff done. What are we gonna do? All right, get those slaves that we released X amount of years, X amount of however long it was. Let's get them back, or let's get some other slaves. And then now it's like you made progress, and then you regressed, and now we're in the same, as we were, before. So it should have been a process, a gradual process, and instead of getting slaves, jobs could have came into play. But we know how that goes. We were inferior. We were 3/5 of a person, so they're not gonna pay us to do something that they had us do for free. While abuse us on top of that, so it's messed up. But they should have came with a plan instead of being really impulsive about it. It should have been a plan behind what it was. Maybe it was planned out. Maybe it was like, all right, so we're gonna release 20,000 slaves, and then here in the future, we're just gonna get all these slaves back, and everything's gonna go back to normal. You never know.
Agree. Jackson?
I just want to echo your 2 points because they are both like really good. Carrington, I was trying to think of like a way to like put it exactly, and I think you said perfectly. Like, they took a step forward and they moved like 3 steps back. That's exactly what happens when they just went against everything they were saying, you know. And I think they should have had a plan. They should have came in knowing what they were doing. How are they going to get these workers, you know, how is the work going to be done? And they didn't, and it backfired. You know, they started struggling. They're like, oh God, this isn't fun anymore. This isn't easy. Let's get these slaves back. Let's get them back to work. Let's go back to our easier lifestyle where they put in the effort, you know.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So, I know, continue what you're going to say, Carrington.
No, I was just saying the same thing you said. I agree.
So the book just goes on to talk a little bit more about this with importing more slaves, mainly just because in the South they were reproducing more in the South than they were in the North. So I kind of find it funny because I wrote down this quote and it says, since slave birth rates remain extremely low in the North, slavery there was sustained by continual supply from Africa, as Benjamin Franklin noted. So we all know that, like, we're not going to discredit Benjamin Franklin at all. He's done a lot, but he is like a founding father, kind of wrote like, give me liberty or give me death. So how do you kind of like feel like knowing that like you've been raised in America and you read about what the founding fathers did, and that one of them just casually just says this like quote, like continuous supply from Africa, and kind of sensing like this country was founded on the principles of like man and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and knowing that a founding father said this. I'm going to start off with Christian, and then we'll head to Jackson, then Carrington.
So you said what about Pope? You was breaking in and out.
So there's this little quote that the book says about, so since slave births remained extremely low in the North, slavery there was sustained by continual supply from Africa, as Benjamin Franklin noted. So I'm asking, we've all been raised in the United States, and we've all read at some point about the founding fathers of America, and not discrediting Benjamin Franklin at all. He's done a lot of great things for this country, but knowing that a founding father said this, knowing that America is founded on the principle of like man, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, like how does this make you feel?
That quote that Benjamin Franklin made,
Like continual supply.
explains America in and of itself. He wants America is based on man, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for white people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what that is, and that's how I feel.
Jackson.
Facts. He's completely right. Like, completely right. You know, when they wrote the Constitution, we weren't thought of at that time. The founding fathers didn't base us. George Washington, you know, presiding over the whole written of the Constitution when they're arguing, he owned slaves. You know, Ben Franklin, he owned slaves. Like Thomas Jefferson, was it Thomas Jefferson? One of them, only like 2 of them didn't have slaves at the time, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Our founding fathers are racist, you know, and if they saw what we were doing today, they wouldn't be too happy about it, sadly. So when we view America back in the context of that, it's frightening, to be honest.
Carrington.
Yes, I definitely agree with what Christian and Jackson both said. I think that because at the time when they were writing the laws and the constitutional rights and everything, they weren't thinking of enslaved people because they didn't even see enslaved people as human. So they never thought, like, they weren't writing those documents for enslaved people. So I just think yeah, I agree with what they both said. It's not.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So it goes on to talk about shaping an African American culture. So it talks about the steady importation of thousands of West African captives that came to the Americas, and also how the African Americans that were already here, who were like born in Americas, those communities talking about in the North were transformed when shiploads of Africans from West Africa began docking in the 1740s. These newcomers infused African culture in the communities, increasing the culture there, and kind of also made up an English speaking, like kind of had like their own syntax and like dialect with West African language and English language. But mid-centuries, Black across the North began to adopt a self-consciously African identity. And I really wanted to talk about the African identity because we talked about it in the way beginnings of chapter 1 about what African identity was. And now that it's being reintroduced in chapter 3, part 1, I'm going to start off with Jackson, and I'm going to ask, how do you feel now that these people self-consciously, like, they know what their identity is? Because some of it was lost.
There's a lot of darkness in this book, but that was like a moment of proudness for me that I had of our people, you know. Like they talk about in the book about how the Blacks that have been here since they first started moving the first boats over, you know, about 100 years beforehand, they still remember their culture. They still mixed in well with their people, you know. We didn't forget. They didn't win. That's what it felt like to me. They didn't win.
Agreed. Carrington?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
So I was asking that with West Africans coming over and like blending in more of their communities with the African Americans that were born in America, West Africans, they were like reintroducing like the culture of like what it was in Africa. So now mid-century, Blacks across the North began to adopt a self-consciously African identity. And we talked about African identity in the beginning of the book. And I just wanted to see how you felt knowing that we were gaining that back.
I definitely think that, like you were saying, when we talked about how when they were ripped from their homes, they had to form their own identity because a lot of them didn't remember the culture that they were surrounded by and their place of birth. But I think that it was amazing to see that they were adapting and adjusting to their situation well enough that they were able to form their own identity and culture within the new place that they had been brought to.
Agreed. Christian?
I agree. We were talking, it makes a lot of sense, and I feel like that's what the identity really fell into. So
Agreed. So the book talks about Negro Election Day.
Yes, sir.
And I know Jackson has some things to say on this, but Negro Election Day, it was largely a New England phenomenon. Just for the acronym, I'm just going to name it NED since that's what it kind of spells.
Yeah.
So it combined the Puritan tradition of Election Day holiday with African rituals of festive roles and reversals in which the powerless temporarily played the role of the powerful. So they elected kings and governors, and they had like a whole party about it. And Black governors and kings were often African-born men of royalty or of royal lineage, and many had the distinction of serving wealthy and powerful white men. So I'm gonna like give this Jackson, since he was really hyped up when we were talking about this before the podcast started. So Jackson, Negro Election Day.
I think it should come back. I love this. I love it so much. Black created, Black owned. This is great. This is so great. I don't have like the most like deep thing to say about this. It's more just another moment of proudness, I'd say, in the book. A day of celebration. Our people, even in the darkest time, we create a day that we can celebrate, something to look forward to. Because if you really think about the bleak outward look of like a Black man and woman at the time, these are probably the few days you look forward to as a Black person in America at this time. And it's just, even reading it, you get the mental image of their happiness, and it's just one of the few moments of proudness you can have in reading this book.
Christian?
They need to bring it back ASAP.
Yes, sir.
They need to bring it back as soon as possible. It is what we need right now. This is just be honest. Is what we need. That's all I have to say.
Carrington?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's what that day kind of reminds me of what we kind of want Juneteenth to be. Just like celebrating Black people and celebrating our wealth and all of our businesses. And I definitely think it should be brought back.
It would be a whole entire party. Like a whole entire block party on your street.
I'm trying to find it. I can't find it.
Ugh, you can't find it, then start it. Okay, never mind. So, so Black Northerners also came together for African-influenced funeral ceremonies, which struck with white observers, mainly just because they thought it was very alarming and pagan. But African-influenced funerals were drawing on West African, just like rites that celebrated the dead with music and song designed to ease their journey into spirit world. And when I read it, I kind of thought of like, they were just like celebrating like that person's life, and also the spiritual aspect of it with West African culture, where they believed in like the ancestors and like the spiritual home and everything. So just celebrating the dead and stuff. Like, of course it's like mourning time, but they're like, no, like we're gonna like celebrate this person. We're going to like ease them into like this new spiritual guidance of where they're going. So I'm gonna start off with Carrington and like Axe. So how do you like feel about it? Like, you have whites who are thinking like these people are crazy for singing and dancing, when to them it's just normal, but to them it's just like, you are not supposed to be doing this. Because it's kind of like been brought into our culture, for which like when someone passes, like you cry about it, you like plan a funeral, you like mourn, and like you bury them and you mourn still, and then like that's it. But like for them, they were like, we're gonna sing and dance, like we're gonna like help this person go on into like the afterlife. So kind of wanted to see what you thought about it.
I think that in our in African history, it's definitely been a tradition to instead mourn for those who have passed away, to celebrate it because they're moving on to a better afterlife, and that they feel that that's something to celebrate. So I don't, in different, everyone processes things like that in their own way, but they have no right to feel like they shouldn't be doing that, because to them, that is their way of processing and mourning the person that has passed away. And I think it's a great way to, because not everyone wants to be sad. That makes the pain, I mean, to just because they're dancing doesn't mean that they're not sad about the person that passed away. It's just their own way of celebrating the life that the person lived and not so much the fact that they passed away.
Jackson?
I agree with both you and Carrington. I think I like me personally, I like the idea of a day of celebration. When I'd pass, I want it to be a day of celebration of my life, you know? Like when my grandma passed, she was like 100 years. She was big important in Illinois. She was the first black principal in Southern Illinois. So when she passed, you know, it was more of a day of celebration of the things she's done instead of, you know, mourning our loss, because, you know, she was such an important person, not only to people in Illinois, but to our family specifically, kind of like the pillar that hold us all together. So, you know, when I pass personally, I'd love for this to be a thing for me, you know, a day of celebration instead of a day of mourning.
Christian?
That is, I mean, you rather celebrate, you know, death, especially if you feel as if the life that you went on to after you die is a better life. So of course, you know, celebration is always better than mourning, sad, and just being down about, you know, somebody passing away. And I feel like it's a good outlook. I like that, you know, I really do. I wish things were like that, you know, when somebody did die in general. You know, I mean, besides the fact, you know, sometimes there are accidental deaths, short-lived. You know, sometimes somebody goes when not expected, you know, too early. But for the most part, celebrations of death should be normalized and not frowned upon, especially here in America. And that's how I feel. Also, I have to go to work soon. So after this, I'm gonna go ahead and head out.
All right, that's fine. Thank you
Okay,
for joining us today, most definitely.
no problem. You have a good day.
You too, Christian.
All right.
So what I'm hearing from the three of us is that we want all the good stuff and that they better be having a barbecue, because if they not, they gonna see us pop out that casket and be like, y'all know
Most definitely.
better.
Definitely hop out the casket. Oh
Hop
my
out the casket, be like, y'all are some monkey mad fools if you thought we were gonna do this. All right, so the last part in the book, we're going to talk about the Great Awakening. So we're going to get into religion a little bit. So the slaves' Great Awakening. So this is like a period to where Christianity is like now being like introduced really into like the African American like society. So if you know about the Great Awakening, which you should, because if you don't, I think someone's history teacher is going to be crying somewhere. But this was a period also saw as a slow beginning of Afro-Christianity in both the North and the South, inspired by the Great Awakening. Great Awakening, a wave of religious revivals that began in New England in the mid-1730s and spread south during the Revolution era. So these ministers, known as Newlights, rejected Protestantism, traditional emphasis on doctrine and ritual in favor of emotional sermons that urged listeners to repent and find spiritual salvation in Christ. They also stressed that the liberating effect of faith were open to all, but did not want to convert Blacks. So I find that very contradicting, that you're out here and you're like, you can be like liberated and everything, but then you're like, hold the phone, like, we are not going to convert Blacks. Like, that is not the case. But you're here preaching to all. So Jackson, how do you feel about that? Like, very conflicting in like everything that I was reading with the Great Awakening.
Yeah. The Great Awakening, it's kind of like, reading it in this book kind of counters what you kind of learn about the Great Awakening. It's kind of, you know, it's not necessarily the best thing ever, you know. It's basically, you know, mm, mm. Carrington, you go first, please.
Okay. No, but I get what you're saying, because
Yeah.
our education, most of my history teachers were all white, and I'm not saying that has anything to do with it, but the version of the Great Awakening that we learned was definitely a positive thing.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't so much like it was in this way. We definitely see a different side of how the Great Awakening was really seen. And I never, when I was learning it in school, I never saw it as contradicting. But now, after reading it in this passage, I think that they definitely used it as a way of manipulation, and then turned right back around and like kind of excluded those that were trying to become like part of the church, I guess, if that makes sense. I don't know if I confused.
It really does, because that's what I was thinking when I was like reading it. It's like the first couple of sentences, I'm just like, this is about to be a whole bunch of contradiction from what I've learned my whole entire life going through K through 12. Like, literally, like, I remember junior year, we spent a whole 3 weeks talking about the Great Awakening. And then when I read on Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, who I've heard so much about, and like what they've done, but then like I realized they owned a lot of slaves themselves. I was just like, the book don't mention this when I was up in class. And then like it talks about Edward saying like he criticized slaves owners who mistreated their slaves, but he maintained that the slaves flourished under the guidance of a good Christian master. And I'm just like, why'd you done gone and like told these people this? Like, the Great Awakening is the most contradicting thing that I've read so far, because we've been taught so much about the Great Awakening and how it like shaped America. But like reading this, I was just like, this is a whole bunch of baloney and manipulation. And then Whitefield, it talks about he encouraged enslaved Blacks to stay in your calling at all cost and give up the thought of seeking freedom from your master. I'm just like, if I was back in that time, I would be giving him a stare that would have sent him 10 feet under. I'm like, you did not just say that. You did not just say that to me, and I'm trying to get the frick out of slavery. Like, no, thank you. Like, no, thank you, sir. Like, are we sure you're really a pastor? Really sure about that? Are you really sure? Because you are speaking some hogwash right now, and I ain't about that. But Jackson,
There is a lot of thoughts you can have about this. Y'all basically covered over this, so I kind of want to talk about more of just Christians of the past, kind of how they're contradictory to themselves, you know. They say all men are freedom, you know, all that basic shit they said back then. But their actions always proved otherwise, you know. And I'm always curious, you know, thinking of the men of the past, you know, did they go to heaven? What happened to them later, you know? What happened afterlife? How did God judge them, you know? And that's just a thought I want y'all to have in the back of your head, people listening.
dang, you have me thinking about it now.
Right.
Like thinking about it then either.
You know, and then I have the question I had earlier that I told you about. That's crazy.
Go ahead and say it.
You want me to go ahead and say it?
Yeah, say it.
Okay, I bet. So Carrington, did you hear this question? I don't know. I think I said this question right before you came in.
Yeah.
But I think we all grew up in a Christian background, right? We can all say that. Yeah. So growing up, I was really Christian. You know, my parents were people at the church. My dad was the lead audio guy. You know, I was there like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, all the time. You know, I knew my pastor, I knew my bishop, I knew all the ministry leaders, had great relationships with all of them. So I So basically, sorry about that. So I wanted to ask y'all, how do y'all feel about your Christian beliefs when they were not the beliefs our people had when they came to this country? We believed in a different religion. We believed in our ancestors, you know. We believed in multiple gods, not just one. So how do you feel about your Christian beliefs knowing that our people came in with different beliefs? And I also want to pose that to the people listening. That's a ridiculously good question to think about.
Yes.
Do you want to go first, Carrington, or do you?
I need a moment to think to really.
Let me speak my piece about it first. So,
Okay.
you know, I'm gonna still stay firm in my Christian beliefs, you know, but you know, knowing where we come from, I kind of view it as something of how we handle religion, how we pass our knowledge of religion on to others, not to force our religion onto others, you know, because that's never right in any way to force our beliefs on someone, you know. That's how I view it and take it as that.
Go ahead, Carrington, because I still need time to think.
Okay, I feel that just because we were kind of, when we were brought over here and enslaved, Christian ideals were definitely forced onto us, and I feel as though those of African descent who didn't know the faiths of their previous ancestors, wanted to have faith in something in the trying times. So I think that although now we do identify as Christian, that doesn't necessarily also correlate to us like denying the fact that there's other beliefs in the world, if that makes sense. Like they yeah. So I think that like we still have the ability, even though we are Christian, we still have the ability to still explore the religion that our ancestors believe in.
I agree, most definitely. I was kind of like Jackson because my mom at our old church, she was the head director of everything with children's church. So I knew the pastor, the first lady, I was friends with like their kids and everything. So just like being raised up in the church and like since I was little, like I didn't really think anything of it at all because I'm just like, yeah, like I'm being like raised Christian. Like I still identify with that faith. I do. But reading the book and like also agreeing with like Carrington was saying that during the dark times they had to have hope in something. And the book does mention that they really were involved and like heavily involved in Christianity because some preachers gave them Bibles, so that's where they learned to read. And so reading from the Bible over and over again, you get new understandings and like new perspective, and it brought them together during that time. And from what they've read in the Bible, they were given this sense of like all men are equal under God, like no matter what. So that hope of like they would be free spiritually, they also had hope in that physically. So I do believe that, but also I do believe that since we got so involved in Christianity because that like hope, we've kind of like left those like our other like African like rituals behind and we just slowly grabbed onto that. I do believe that a little bit and on why it's not incorporated into our Christianity today. But most definitely like for me, like I still like I'm starting to learn like a little bit more of like the ancestors and like I'm still kind of like believing in it just like a little bit because it's like who we are. If you trace our bloodlines all the way back, like we come from there. So there is just sentimental like ties to that. So Good question, Jackson. Good question.
Thank
Question.
Do you have any more questions that you want to throw at us?
I have another one if you want to hear it. This one's a little easier, I'd say. In the book, they talk about the North, how it was more willing to give up their slaves than the South. Why do you think this is the case? So it's basically like, why do you think the South is like held on to slavery so much and the North was more easily able to give it up?
Why was the North so easily willing to give up their slaves?
Not easily, of course, but like, why was the North first before the South? And why did the South hold on to that viewpoint so hard?
I think from our understanding of like what we've learned about American history, in the book we'll probably talk about more of it and might bring up some other contradicting facts that we did not know about. We know from like American history that the South was booming in like cotton, and like the North was more into the textile industry and things of that nature, and like they had different revenues of income, while the South was solely dominated in its economic prosper of cotton. So we've all had stories of like our parents were born in the South and like how some of them, they had to go out to go like pick cotton, like just for like their family and stuff. And they tell us stories about like, it's not easy picking cotton. And so I think it was just easier for the North because like no one up there is raising cotton up there. So you really don't have like the needs to have that much labor, especially free labor. So I think that's why they were able to give up like their slaves a whole lot faster in the South. And like we knew that because like we fought a war about it. Literally. So I think that's why it's a whole lot harder. And like, let's just be honest, like they're not paying like a squat. So it's just free and oppressive nature too. So I think that was a whole lot harder for the South to do than the North.
Yeah.
Really? So.
No, I definitely agree with what Sierra said. I think that the North didn't give up enslaved people because they were selfless. I think it was more so just because they felt like they had other, like you were saying, streams of income and ways to survive and like build their wealth, that they were just like, if you really need them, then we can give them to you. So it wasn't more because they really thought that enslaved people, because giving them to the South wouldn't make them no longer believe in enslaved people just because they gave away their the enslaved people, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. That's very true. I didn't even think about that too, either. Those are my questions.
Yay, I'm glad that you answered those questions. So that is the end of chapter 3, part 1. So stay tuned in for next week when we talk about chapter 3, part 2. I just want to say thank you for Jackson and Carrington for being on this call. Would have said thank you to Christian, but he had to go to work. Bam's got to make his money. So really just wanted to thank you guys for hopping on.
Of course.